Hi, I'm Sophia Yeshi. I'm a graphic designer and illustrator from Baltimore, Maryland, currently living in Brooklyn, New York. I create work that's bold, expressive, colorful, and demands attention. And I've worked with clients such as Instagram, Refinery29, Adobe, and Converse. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about basic principles of graphic design. So we're going to start with contrast. Contrast is really important, and it's something that I use in a lot of my work. In fact, in almost all of my work, you will see that there is usually a heavy amount of contrast. So what contrast is just a difference between elements. So it's being able to see a juxtaposition, whether it's between the colors. You can create contrast with typography, with shapes, whether it's a square and a circle, those two elements juxtapose one another. So it's a really useful way of creating visual interest. As you can see, there is contrast. This is the home page of my website. There is a lot of contrast between these shapes. There are some that have some sharper edges, some that are rounder, as well as between the colors, the line thickness, there's just tons of contrast. Contrast is a way it can draw your eye in. For example, in this piece right here, there is a contrast between the background, which is this navy blue, which is a lot darker, and this bright orange color. So it's creating interest because your eye is automatically drawn to the center of the piece, which is where I want you to focus on. So the next one is rhythm and patterns, and this is another concept that I use in a lot of my work as well. So rhythm and patterns is about creating repetition in your work. And you can have regular rhythm, you can have irregular rhythm. It really just depends on your preference and what your goal is. So when I was looking at my work, I realized I tended to have a lot of regular rhythm and patterns in my work where the elements are all kind of repeating in a way that doesn't look too off. Like it looks like it's supposed to be cohesive. So in this piece, it was a lot of, organic shapes in the background, and that after you combine them all together and kind of lay them out in the background, it does create a rhythm in your work. So for this piece for Converse, you can see the shapes in the background have a pattern as well. And even in the way that it is animating with the colors, I'm using the same colors and I'm just kind of moving them along. So that shows a regular rhythm as well. When it comes to patterns, it's important that you have to have a repeating element, otherwise it's not a pattern. So as you can see in this piece, I am repeating shapes and they are all around, and I do repeat like circles, you'll see like this flower, and this is creating a pattern. Color is something that is so incredibly important. It's probably my favorite thing about designing anything, and I usually save it for last, because color really sets the tone for your work and for the mood. You can see I use a lot of the same colors in my work, and it took me a while to really establish a palette that I felt like speaks to me. So in my work, you'll see a lot of this magenta, navy blue, and yellows, and I have combined tones that are darker and harsher with tones that are lighter. So I think that it's really important to find colors that speak to you. If you look at any painter, illustrator, graphic designer, most of the time you're gonna notice a similarity. They tend to use a lot of the same colors. And if you were to pull their work, into Illustrator and look at the codes, you're gonna see a consistent palette, and that just makes your work look more cohesive. Of course, you can always break outside of that, but I think just having a general idea of, do you like lighter tones? Do you like darker colors? What colors really speak to you and feel like you? And that's really gonna help your work feel more cohesive as a whole. So when I was defining my palette and the colors that I liked, I spent a lot of time looking at other designs and illustrators and saw what colors they use. And I ended up just having like a board of visual inspiration. And so there was a time when I was creating my branding. This was the initial color palette that I created, and this was in January of this year. And this was really a great starting point for me. I used this palette and it has evolved over this year. And this same palette that I created is now kind of the core basis of my work, and it still really speaks to me. So I just looked at colors that I liked. I knew I liked, lavenders and blues. I looked at colors that paired well together that I could use for a variety of different purposes. So, I didn't want to just have too many colors that were the same hue or the same tone. I tried to have darker and lighter shades. And even now, I still will have to kind of adjust depending on, what the piece is. But you can even see like a lot of my work has those same colors in it. Right here, this is literally all of those colors except that lime green because it was a little too bright for this piece. But these colors are pretty much what I use in most of my work. And there are times when I do switch it up, but it still complements this palette and it all still feels like me. Like for example, this piece is a lot more pastel, but it still has a lot of those tones. The lilacs, the greens, all of those still feel really cohesive with my work. So balance as a principle in graphic design has to do with the visual weight of a piece. So all of the elements and how they interact together. A lot of the times, we like to see things balanced and symmetrical. So if you look at my work, I think I tend to favor symmetrical or balanced pieces, meaning that if I put a line on this side of the composition, most likely I'm going to put a line on the other side to balance it. Or I may place a figure in the center. Sometimes you want to place your figure off center purposely to create, a little bit of off balance, which is when you talk about like the rule of thirds in photography, that's that concept as well, that it can be more interesting to have a figure or an object a little bit off center to add to visual interest. So another one of my favorite concepts that I think gets overlooked is white space. White space is not literally white space. So if you look at my work, you may be thinking, I don't see any white. That's because it's more so about allowing the elements in your composition or in your design to breathe. So giving objects, text, room. If I didn't have any white space, this text would be right up against the edge of the frame or the composition, and it wouldn't have any room to breathe. And so when you first start out, a mistake that a lot of designers make is just pushing everything really close together. So you may have an image and text right next to it. And that can be a purposeful choice, but most of the time it's gonna look a little bit better if you just give it some padding and give it some room.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe to stay up to date on all of our latest videos.